welcome to the first edition of NFL Weekly. I'm Nick Senefani.
And I'm Brenden Garula.
Alright, so we're going to go through all of the games of the week and tell you who performed well and who undercut their standards for the week and had a rough start to the season. Alright, so let's start. The first game, Texans-Saints. The Saints pulled out a close one, 30-28, and Drew Brees had a really good day. 370 yards, 2 touchdowns, while also throwing 1 pick, but it didn't matter in the end. Michael Thomas, impressive, of course. 10 receptions for 123 yards. And Hopkins never can have a bad game, 111 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns.
Game number 2, Denver Broncos against Oakland Raiders. Josh Jacobs had a very impressive NFL debut with 85 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. Even though the Broncos lost, Joe Flacco had a pretty impressive Broncos debut with 268 yards and a touchdown. Also, with Tyrell Williams of the Raiders getting 6 receptions, 105 yards and a touchdown, helped the Raiders pull out the win.
The third game, the Bills and the Jets. John Brown had a very impressive Bills debut with racking in 7 receptions, 123 yards, and a touchdown, as well as Devin Singletary, too, who also had an impressive rookie debut, 4 attempts for 70 yards, a very good average. Josh Allen, I don't know if he can step it up, but not the most impressive sophomore. First game of his sophomore season with 2 interceptions, with the Bills pulling out a slim 1-point lead.
The next game is the former NFC champions in the Los Angeles Rams and the Carolina Panthers. Todd Gurley had a solid 14 attempts for 97 yards, continuing where he left off. On the other hand of the Panthers, Christian McCaffrey had a big day despite his loss. He had 19 attempts, 128 yards, and 2 touchdowns on the rushing end. He also had 10 receptions and 81 yards on the receiving end, putting up a solid day, and especially for his fantasy owners.
The next game also brought another big fantasy performer of the week. Dalvin Cook in the new Vikings run-first offense racked up 111 rushing yards as well as 2 touchdowns. Kirk Cousins wasn't on the good receiving end of that, though, only throwing for 98 yards and 1 touchdown. But the dominant Vikings defense led them to a 28-12 win over the Falcons.
Game number 6 brings us to Philadelphia when they hosted the Washington Redskins. Deshaun Jackson had a solid return back to Philadelphia when he had 8 receptions, 154 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Terry McLaurin had a solid rookie debut with 5 receptions, 125 yards, and a touchdown, bringing his fantasy owners to their feet. Case Keenum had a very solid Redskins debut with 380 yards and 3 touchdowns. Carson Wentz has also proved that he deserved to get the starting job over Nick Foles, throwing for 313 yards and 3 touchdowns. And the Eagles' performers led them to a 32-27 dub.
The next game brings us to Cleveland for the highly anticipated Browns season debut. With Baker Mayfield struggling at the helm of the Browns offense with a little bit of a sophomore struggle, throwing 3 interceptions, as well as Marcus Mariota also surprising a lot of people, throwing for 250 yards and 3 touchdowns, a good start to the year. A.J. Brown with a very, very solid rookie debut for a 3rd rounder or 2nd rounder, I forget, with racking up 3 receptions and 100 yards, and Derrick Henry coming back right where he left off, putting up 84 yards and a touchdown with a solid fantasy game. The dominant Titans defense led them to a very surprising 30-point win over the Browns, 43-13.
The next game is the Chiefs-Jags, where Patrick Mahomes left right where he left off. He threw for 378 yards and 3 touchdowns. 9 of those receptions and almost 200 of those yards were thrown to Sammy Watkins, who hauled in 9 receptions, 198 yards, and three touchdowns. DJ Chark of the Jacksonville Jaguars had 4 receptions, 146 yards, and a touchdown in his rookie debut. Still not enough to beat the high-flying Chiefs in Jacksonville.
The next game was a dominant performance by Lamar Jackson and the Ravens against the struggling, tanking Miami Dolphins. Lamar opened the eyes of all of his haters, throwing for 324 yards and 5 touchdowns, 147 of those yards coming to the rookie sensation Hollywood Brown, as well as Mark Ingram having a fantastic Ravens debut with 107 yards and 2 touchdowns. Earl Thomas also with a pick in his Ravens debut to lead them to a 59-10 win over the Miami Dolphins.
The next game we have is the Bengals against the Seahawks. The Bengals came in with a lot of doubters going into Seattle, but at first they proved them wrong. Andy Dalton threw for 418 yards and 2 touchdowns, which 418 yards is his career high. With his third season, John Ross hauled in 7 receptions, 158 yards, and 2 touchdowns. That was not enough to fall to Seattle when Russell Wilson threw for almost 200 yards and 2 touchdowns.
The next game brought us to San Diego when the Colts took on the Chargers, with Jacoby Brissett taking over for the recently retired Andrew Luck. Marlon Mack had a fantastic game with 174 yards and a touchdown, as well as T.Y. Hilton becoming Jacoby Brissett's favorite target already with 87 yards and 2 touchdowns. But of course, the consistent Phillip Rivers and Keenan Allen duo performed well as usual, with Rivers throwing for 333 yards and 3 touchdowns, and Allen racking in 123 of those yards and a touchdown to lead them to a 30-24 overtime win over the Colts.
The next game we have was a disgusting 49ers-Buccaneers game. The 49ers pulled out a 31-17 win because Jameis Winston having his struggles as usual with the 194 yards, a touchdown, and 3 interceptions. Not much to say about this ugly game.
Another eye-opener here in Dallas, where Dak Prescott opened his eyes to the haters to throw for 405 yards and 4 touchdowns, proving that he deserves the mega contract he's been asking for. Michael Gallup with a fantastic sophomore season opener, racking in 158 yards, and Evan Engram also with a fantastic debut of the season, racking in 116 and a touchdown, with Saquon, of course, with a solid 120 yards rushing. But the Cowboys pulled this one out 35-17 because of the Giants' lack of talent elsewhere on the defensive side.
Next, we're in Arizona, where the rookie sensation Kyler Murray struggled at first, but in the end, he led the Cardinals to a comeback. Even though they ended up tying at 27, he threw 308 yards and 2 touchdowns. Larry Fitzgerald, in his ancient season, hauled in 8 receptions, 113 yards and a touchdown. On Detroit's side, T.J. Hawkinson, 6 receptions, 131 yards, and a touchdown in his rookie debut. All those coming out from Matthew Stafford's 385 yards and 3 touchdowns. Lions looked pretty sharp even though they tied.
We got an ugly one here in Foxborough. Ben Roethlisberger in his first game without Antonio Brown struggles with 276 yards and an interception, as well as James Conner, who's not playing where he left off, only racking up 21 yards off of 10 attempts. On the Patriots side, Philip Dorsett looks like a much improved player, bringing in 95 yards and 2 touchdowns. Tom Brady, of course, in his 1,000,000th season, still throwing for 341 and 3 touchdowns, and the dominant Patriots defense holds the Steelers to 3 points in a 33-3 win.
For the last game, we were in Chicago when they hosted the Green Bay Packers in their ancient rivalry. Mitch Trubisky struggled with 228 yards and an interception. It was not a very high offensive game, but the Packers did prove that they have a very strong defense this year. And that sums up our That sums up the last game of the first week of the NFL season.
And that leads us into our Team of the Week segment, who we had to give it to the Baltimore Ravens with a dominant 59-10 win over the Miami Dolphins. Lamar Jackson with a fantastic game to open up the year. 17 of 20 yards, 17 of 20 completions, 324 yards, and 5 touchdowns, leading him to a perfect passer rating. With Mark Ingram having a very, very impressive Ravens debut, and Hollywood Brown having one of the best rookie wide receiver debuts of all time. Of course, to add into other receivers like Miles Boykin caught their first career touchdown of his rookie year, and Mark Andrews had a fantastic start to his sophomore season, racking in 108 yards and a touchdown. The Ravens defense looks again to be dominant, causing the Dolphins quarterbacks to throw 2 picks and holding them to 10 points while putting up a dominant 59. This team could be scary.
This brings us to our last segment of Player of the Week. Dak Prescott has won our Player of the Week vote with 25 for 32, throwing for 405 yards, 4 touchdowns, and no interceptions with a perfect passer rating. He showed all of his haters that he deserves the big contract that he's been asking for, leading the Dallas Cowboys to a 35-17 win over the New York Giants.
Thank you for joining us on the first edition of NFL Weekly. I'm Nick.
And I'm Brenden.
And we'll be back next week to recap Week 2.